Until fairly recently, I would have introduced myself as a vocalist first, or singer first, and then a composer, because I think for me that performer composer thing was like always very, very blurred, and it's a big part of my practice is to still be in touch with my instrument, as it were. So I started as a Carnatic classical vocalist, so that's singing Indian classical music, which is a very interesting tradition because all instrumentalists have to learn how to sing. So if we were learning this particular piece in the like Indian way, and maybe it's a worthwhile exercise for you to do on your own, you'd have to sing through all these lines, even the lines that don't necessarily feel like instinctively vocal. This is part of the tradition, is that all the repertoire is the same. So we don't have like a flute concerto separate from like a violin concerto. All the material is music that actually has text to it. As instrumentalists, your job is to bring that emotion out, even if your instruments don't have the ability to say text per se. So we really believe you sing kind of through your instrument, and anything that's specific to what instruments can do, like double stops, for example, which most vocal traditions don't have the ability to do two notes at once, although not every vocal tradition is that way. But you use those to sort of ornament and tell the story of that piece more thoroughly, but you're still sort of singing through your instrument. So that was a great way to be introduced. And I did play some other physical instruments outside of voice. And I studied some piano. I played some of the Indian classical instrument that my mother plays, which is called veena. So this is a string fretted instrument, basically. And it's plucked here. And it's kind of like a cousin of the guitar. It's the grandmother of the sitar, if you've heard of the sitar. So it's the older instrument that sort of inspired that one to come later on. And you play sort of going up and down the fretboard like this, but you also move this way where you bend the notes in and out like this. So pulling makes the pitch rise, basically. And my mother, and this isn't standard, but my mother can pull up to a fourth, basically. So that gives you a lot of space to get the real beauty of Indian classical music, which is the music that happens between semitones or half steps. It's that journey that we take in the notes. And you might have seen there's a little bit of that in Son of Pandu, but I did want it to still be idiomatic to what people were sort of familiar with from their playing. So there's some of these, even this da 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 da. The plain phrase would have been but it's na na. So you can kind of see there's a little bit of that sort of song line through it. Oh, and lastly, I did study Western classical music. So there was a time where I was studying opera as well too. So that's sort of my musical background. I am very close to my mother, so I grew up with a musician mom, which was really, really cool. But I will say that, and I'm sort of lucky that she's quite famous and established in her world, and I grew up with Indian classical music. But you're in Michigan, all of you, right? Is that right? Yes. So I live in Minnesota, and that's also where I grew up. And at the time I grew up, especially, there weren't that many outlets for Indian classical music in school. So it was like sort of this interesting thing where the music I was learning in school wasn't really the music I was either part of my home life or even like this rich, cool life that I got access to through my mom's eyes. So it was both. I think if we had grown up in India, where my mom was like quite famous too, like it would have been a very, very different experience growing up. But for me, this was just sort of this like kind of strange fun facts to tell at school, but didn't really permeate until I forced the two to permeate, and I started writing music that brought the two together. I can tell you about my more general composing process, and I can also tell you about the process for this piece, because this one was quite different. So generally for me, I enjoy composing to be kind of a slow unfolding process. So it will start with kind of little tiddly ideas. I wouldn't even call them like concrete music, just kind of come to mind. It might be a sort of motif or a phrase that's sort of stuck in my head. I love using my phone. Anyone use the voice memos app to like capture ideas ever? That's my like go-to number one compositional tool, is to just record things on my phone, ideas I have. So sometimes it's like, like a phrase. Sometimes it's just like an idea, like it's just in words. It's not really in a musical form. It's just, I'll just kind of be sort of speaking to myself about this idea I've had. I love to go on walks. That's another place where I sort of collect ideas. It's just like going on a meandering walk, and then in the middle of the road, I'm sure my neighbors love me. I'll be like singing into my phone, hopefully quietly, but that's another area where I get inspiration. At some point, all of those ideas sort of have to coalesce into something. Has anyone ever seen those Instagram or TikTok videos of people making cotton candy before?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So do you know how the process is sort of like they kind of like whip around this like stick? It's either in the machine or it's in the air, depending on how they're collecting it. And then it goes from the wisps into like something substantial. I feel like that's kind of the composing process in a way. It's sort of this gathering of ideas that might be really disparate, that might have come over years and years of time, but you have to at some point sort of organize them into something. I find it really useful to take it sometimes into a non-musical medium. So I might like sort of draw like a vertical or horizontal sort of map of what I'm thinking of doing. So like I might do something like very, very excited activity. I know at the beginning, so I'll draw a lot of scribbles on that map. The x-axis will sort of be time, if you're wondering what this map kind of looks like. And then, maybe it'll be a little quieter in the section, put it in non-musical terms, especially if I'm a little stuck. That kind of helps me. And then it's a process of going back and forth between the overall structure, so like sort of zoomed out view, bird's eye view, and then really zooming in and getting those details to sort of be what I want them to be. And you just keep massaging it and massaging it. And there's other artists in the room, right? People mentioned pottery or even I think learning language can be kind of a similar process to this. But you just sort of eventually you have to know when you're sort of going to let it go into the world. And sometimes, you might feel like you didn't quite achieve what you set out to do at the beginning. Like you might have had this grand idea that you're going to write something humongous, and what you wrote at the end was quite different. That's part of the beauty of the process when it goes from abstract to concrete. But another thing is that I've heard once a composer say that their whole goal with like creating is basically to keep getting at that original goal. So like if you finish a piece and you didn't achieve exactly what you wanted to achieve, then you write another piece. So that's, I think, a very interesting idea for approaching art at all, is that it doesn't have to be perfect when you finish it. There's that story, this is actually a pottery story. Anyone ever heard of this, of the teacher who gave half their students like the assignment of just create one perfect pot during the course of a semester, and the other like 30 students were told to just make as many pots as you could. Didn't have to be good or didn't have to be bad. And then at the end, this teacher found that the people who had created a lot, even if it wasn't very good, ended up with better output than the people who were really concerned about getting that perfect pot and didn't practice the act enough. So I think that's a lot of the creativity. It's just as you practice your instrument, you have to sort of practice being in the creative space, being uncomfortable with like it's kind of tricky or being stuck, and like just being okay with that, which I think is a good way to live your life too, is getting comfortable with what's uncomfortable as well. That's kind of the process generally. For this piece, so as you know, Son of Pandu is about Arjuna, who is this major character of the Mahabharata, which is one of the two great epics of Hindu culture. So a lot of the like smaller stories in the culture actually come from the Mahabharata, like they're like little chapters in it. So it is definitely the longest of the two epics that we have too. But I think the reason why I decided to think about Arjuna at all is because I don't know if you have your scores in front of you. I can reference if you want specific things in the piece. So I started this piece by composing the material at, I think it's letter D. Yes, letter D. It is called Archer's Arrows. You might have seen that's like marked as the performance or tempo marking. So that was the imagery that I had in mind, basically, is that all of these phrases, this, it's like little like arrows flying again and again and again. So each of them have so much direction and power and force, but it's only when you get like the multiple ones happening kind of at the same time, as you can tell, it sort of gets blurred as it goes on with the piece, that we get really something of force. So Arjuna's most famous attribute, for those who don't know his story that well, is that he's an archer. That's like what he's most known for. And then through the process of this piece, I think I knew some things about Arjuna, but I started exploring a little bit more about his character. So I kind of started with this, like the most salient image of this fictional or semi-fictional character, depending on who you ask. And then it turned into, let's actually explore all the different facets of this fascinating character who is kind of situated as a kind of half mortal, so is possibly descended from divine deities and has a very important divine function in the religion, but is also many times pointed out that he is human, so he's supposed to sort of represent all of us in some of the stories as well. In a technical sense, this would be called the Pallavi, which is spelled, I can put it in the chat maybe, and then so you can have it later. Pallavi is kind of the first line or chorus line of a composition. So in the structure, it's like sort of chorus, verse, roughly speaking, or it's a little better to maybe say it's sort of A, B, A, C, A is the structure of most Carnatic compositions. And even Hindustani has some remnants of it, although some of this has faded over time in Hindustani music and has been retained in Carnatic music. I know that you are also learning about North Indian classical music, so there is a connection there. So this is kind of sort of the chorus line, which is why it comes back at the end. This piece doesn't follow fully the structure of Indian classical music. It's balancing sort of the two different worlds, but it is definitely sort of, I guess you could think of it as like the theme music. It's like Arjuna is here. So we have this kind of this awesome, heroic, very cool, very suave, very great with whatever. I mean, he's a cool character. But then I would say the piece also explores his inner world, which isn't maybe as calm and cool and collected as he might appear on the outside, where he's basically like sunglasses emoji on the outside. And on the inside, you know, this material that you have where it sort of fragments a little bit. So from letter B, which is all these those are sort of the doubts and the kind of questions he asks, which is part of his role in Hinduism, is that when he has this big conversation called the Bhagavad Gita, where he expresses his doubts and he's not sure if he's a believer and he's not sure about what he should do, and he's very lost, as many of us feel at times, whether it's about religion or about life in general. He's kind of overwhelmed. So that's sort of that character there. And then letter C in that slow material is kind of him finding that inner peace, which is this person who meditates for years. So he can have multitude of things. And I think all of us are more than one thing, right? Our personality, we might seem to some as extroverted, but we might have a lot going on the inside too, conversations with ourselves. That's sort of what this piece is trying to get at, is the many facets of Arjuna, as well as Arjuna being sort of the mirror of humankind, you know, sort of showing the mirror to us. And we have many facets too. But you probably might have noticed you've certainly noticed this when you're playing it, but maybe when you're singing it too, try to notice there's slight variations each time you do it. That is called in Indian music Sangati, which is, I've just put it in the chat if you want to check it out later, but it's basically, you kind of have this chorus line, but then you do variations on that chorus line each time it comes back. And then you can see that the second bar of each of these phrases is always a little bit different, but it takes you back to the E flat, which will land you on the F. That's another principle of this music, is it's very cyclical kind of music. So you want to make sure that whatever your combination of notes are, you want to land on the note before the F, which is in this mode, kind of E flat, or the note after the F would be G, would be acceptable. But you couldn't do a version where you sang ta 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 da 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 da. Like I can't finish on the B flat. I have to get myself back to the F. Right. So it's very scalar music in many ways, even though there's a lot of note skipping too, right? That da 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 is there's a skip in that. This is a rule of how you improvise in the music, as well as a rule of the compositional structure, is that if you're jamming on something and you have one line like this that we're doing these sangatis, these variations on, you got to come back to that note. That's a very critical principle in the music. I think at the time when I was writing this piece, I didn't know it, but I was having a lot of questions about like my own sense of spirituality, about what faith means. especially in a religion like mine, it's not a proselytizing religion, aka it's not a conversion religion, so you can't really convert to it or from it. So it's a very like loosey goosey religion too, because it's quite old, where it's not as organized as like denominations or other kinds of faiths out there have like very clear processes of what it means to believe and not to believe. So I think I was trying to get my head around that when I wrote this piece, which is interesting because it's about a Hindu figure. But I think that there are times where this particular figure, this is why I think I maybe do, to the earlier question, maybe I do kind of associate with Arjuna in a way, because despite being this incredibly important Hindu figure, he has doubts at times. He's not always sure about like whether he believes or not, which is kind of part of the story, that it's okay to have doubts or it's okay to kind of ask questions. And so I think I was sort of wrestling with like, for example, I find meditation to be something that's amazing, but I'm not necessarily very good at meditating. And I had something I have to, again, practice and forgive myself for it. Have any of you ever done any meditation, by the way? Ever been in that process? It's, yeah, a little bit. Yeah. It can be a little hard, right? To forgive yourself for it, in the sense of like when your mind inevitably thinks about something else in that moment, the point is to bring it back without judgment, is kind of what most teachers will say. That's hard. It's hard not to be like, why is your mind such a monkey? You know, like at least that's what I tell myself. So those kinds of aspects, I think, I suppose, in the larger aspect of all of that is just trying to be a better friend, a better person, a little bit more present in my daily life, try to recognize the daily kindness that people give me. And that in order to do that, I have to be present. So I think I was at a stage where I was just trying to figure out all those things for myself. I loved it. Yeah, I wouldn't say this piece is dedicated to anyone in the ways that some pieces are. Actually, I think I composed it for myself. So I wrote this piece at a time where I was working on a lot of projects that were sort of maybe commissioned by people, or I was just kind of starting to discover what my voice is. And this piece was not written with any kind of oversight. I didn't show it to a composition teacher or anything like that. And one reason for that is that it's kind of different from a lot of what you see in new music. It's got a lot of those Indian classical musical elements, but at the same time, it's got some very, very standard Western classical elements. So there weren't any people at the time that I was working with who were doing things like writing music like this or encouraging me to write music like this. So it was sort of like my passion project in a way to write this piece. So yeah, I kind of wrote it for myself. And then it's interesting now, some years on since I wrote the piece, it's turned into like, it's a piece that people enjoy playing. And it was probably the first piece where I was really discovering what my creative voice, what I wanted it to be, like what I wanted to say with my music. But at the time, it was just sort of a secret piece for myself until it got premiered. I mentioned in the beginning that I like to write slowly, and this piece was written in 48 hours. So not slowly. It was kind of like, just like spat out on the page. But I do think that because it was like this passion project, and there was all these like things that I had wanted to do for a while that was out without like anyone dictating how it would go or what the forces would be or how long it should be or anything like that. I think that those ideas, kind of in the cotton candy metaphor, had been sort of circulating for a while, and then it just sort of all came out immediately. And just like this piece, sounds like the way cotton candy tastes, probably immediate gratification. But yeah, I think it's a little bit unique compared to some of my other pieces in that sense. I will also say that when I got to the stage where I realized that it was coming together about 40 or 50% of the way through, I just wanted to power through. I didn't want to let it sit. For some reason, I just wanted to write it right away. And so I have to credit Cherry Coke, Airheads, and other sour candy for powering me through that. It's still a bad habit that occasionally, when I'm like really deep in the middle of edits, I love to turn to sugar for my fuel. I thought I had nipped that habit in the bud, and then last week I finished another piece and I reached for some Lindt chocolate to do that one. But yeah, I think that, there's something to be said about when you write it in sort of one flow, the continuity of the idea stays very clear. But there's also something to be said about letting a piece take its time. So I think both processes are interesting and useful. It's now a little more than 5 years ago. but I was a senior in undergrad. So fairly young, I guess, and fairly early on in my compositional life. So it still has a special like feeling for me because of when it was. So I think for any of you who are creating things now, whether it's artistic works or creative writing or the other things we've discussed today, I think you'd be surprised to find how those works can still have a resonance, even though you might be quote unquote a student. Now they can still resonate with people even after you've created them. Like I said, this is an epic that's, I don't know, like thousands of pages. So I won't go that far into detail, but basically the Pandavas, Panch means five in these languages. So that helps you remember that's five brothers, and their name means five brothers too. They're the heroes of the story. And what happened was there was a kind of a question of a line of succession. Somebody who should have been king in this family, so like their great grandfather, for example, had renounced that right to be king because of certain things that had happened in the past, and so on and so forth. And somebody who would have been a great leader said, "No, I won't take the throne because somebody else wants it." There was this whole history that happened. So what ended up happening is by the time they came to the Pandavas generation, or rather their father, King Pandu and such, there was a big question of who should inherit the throne. And it was basically thought that the Pandavas should. And also there was this whole thing that they were like considered to be very, very fair and kind rulers, that they would kind of share this throne, or that the oldest brother would have the throne and these crown princes would serve by the side. But unfortunately, their uncle and a lot of their other family did not want to give up that power. So even though it was their like kind of rightfully their throne, that uncle did not want to give them the power. The uncle kind of hilariously had 100 children, 100 sons. So their cousins are called the Kauravas, and there's 100 of them. So if you thought 5 was a lot, there's another huge branch of family on the other side. The uncle was kind of unwell. Like he had a couple disabilities that at the time were believed that he should not be ruling, therefore, which is not fair, but that's kind of part of the story. So the question definitely was that, maybe the throne should go back to the Pandavas, but their father had also been unwell too, so that's how it ended up with him. So there's this whole like complicated history. It goes back like generations of who gets the throne. That's what it all comes down to, as do a lot of epics and a lot of cultures are about who gets the throne. Basically, the Pandavas, they ended up at one point, like they found their own place, another place where they'll have their own palace and everything, but they lost it in a gamble, a game of dice, which you might be in a sort of an anecdote you might have heard of before. And people were like, you shouldn't actually like, the game is a game of dice. Like you can't like actually like, yes, they lost that game, but that should not be considered like the fate of a whole kingdom lost in that sense. But the evil cousins were like, nope, you lost your chance. And it turned out that they even like there's some magical pair of dice that they skewed for them to win the kingdom. So they were then stripped of everything and they were banished and pushed to the forest land. So Kunti is their mom. The father, in this case Pandu, was a kind of ill, sickly person who died also. So Kunti now has to take care of these sort of 5 grown men who are looking for a purpose in life and completely lost. So as a mom, she is kind of viewed culturally as having a lot of importance because she's the one who motivates them to keep going. And they also are in turn, are taking care of her because she's lost her home as well. She's no longer this royal queen and everything. But they have 2 decisions to face, basically. One is like, how do they get their kingdom back? And 2, the bigger question is the cousins, because they're quite corrupt, these evil 100 cousins, are doing things to the rest of the land that are like negatively affecting the citizens of that land. Like they're basically exploiting them to further their own greed. So they also have to like, it's coming to the point where they need to fight with their cousins and get back the throne because their cousins are like terrible rulers who are very evil and everything to other people too. And that's the crux of the story, is they have to raise arms against their own family, which is like a very, very difficult decision, especially when for Arjuna and others, like family is very, very important. That's why they've stuck together this whole time. And even if they don't love their cousins, they're still their cousins. So this is like kind of the central tension of this piece. But Kunti herself is a really interesting figure. She also is a little complex because she has a child earlier than the Pandavas that is supposed to be sort of like an immaculate conception situation, where somebody told her that she would get the power to, if she ever like thought of a god in this way, she'll get pregnant. And she was quite young, so she thought that was kind of a joke. So she did the thing and then accidentally got pregnant, and she was not yet married, and it was a whole thing. So she had this secret baby, and she hid the baby, and she actually left the baby out like on a river. And that baby was adopted by a family that was pretty poor, but still took the effort of raising the child. But she never told that. She saw that that person became, his name was Karna, he became a very important figure in the story as well. But she never told him that he has brothers. She never said that I'm your biological mother. So, and he ended up being quite wronged in the story throughout too, and like things happen. So it's, she's a little bit complex. I think the reason is that she's supposed to be kind of human. That's the point of all of these stories, is that some of these figures, even Arjuna, they're not perfect. Like they make some mistakes along the way because they're supposed to sort of tell us about our own selves in a sense. So she's a very interesting figure, but I don't think my mother would have done to Karna, to her oldest son, what Kunti did to hers. But she was confused. She was too young when she had the kid. She didn't know what to do. So this is a story from like thousands of years ago, and yet it's so interesting that it has like relevance today now when we think about topics of pregnancy and having children are like at the forefront in a lot of ways, both politically and just socially. We still don't really have answers for what people can do in that situation, really, especially, different parts of the country answer that question differently. So, and the shame that was associated with that and all that, is still something that's ongoing. So it's just very interesting that these ancient topics can have some kind of contemporary relevance. Saying. So I was thinking about, teachers and mentors. I was reaching the end of my undergraduate study, and I was kind of thinking about who do I owe to this point. But I also think it goes beyond like the obvious teachers and mentors. I mean, those are very clear, like people you owe and want to thank. But I think friends was a huge part of it as well, and people who had intentionally or unintentionally sort of shown me like new ways of thinking. So, for example, it could have been like an off the cuff remark that was made by someone, but it sparks you to think in another way. Or let me give you a concrete example. This morning I was printing some music for an event in a couple weeks time, and the person at FedEx who was giving me my order had sent it in online, and they were just picking it up, and they said, your scores are at the bottom. I had to print a few things. They're like, the scores are at the bottom. And I have never gone into a FedEx and anyone has ever said your scores are at the bottom. They usually just talk about it as prints or like they don't know that it's called a score. That's a parlance that's familiar to those of us who are in the musical world. So this person was like super overworked because there were a lot of people coming in and out at the FedEx. But I had to ask them, like, are you a musician? And then we had an amazing conversation about a clarinet player who has kind of left that life, but is trying to like sort of find their way back as an adult, find a band to play in and all these kinds of things. And we were just trading recommendations back and forth about like where they could find music in town. And it was just this really cool, like unexpected moment. And if I had been a little bit more in my head, as I'm often am, I'm thinking about what's the next task I have to do, what are the errands I have to run. I'm traveling tomorrow, so could have been thinking sort of about, what do I need to pack. I might have missed their comments about scores, and that would have been a chance for connection that I would have missed. So I think especially in the state of the world now, where it sort of feels like, if I may say, the world is kind of on fire, and literally is in some places, it's that much more important to hold the people around us, the people we know and the people we want to know, like that much closer, and try to find those moments of spontaneous connection, or just be open to it, I guess, because it's always there around us. There's always something the person delivering your mail always has an interesting story to tell you, or the person you're grocery shopping and the person shopping next to you also has something interesting to say. But we so often don't feel like we have time to listen to it, or our lives are too stressful to be aware of those things. And I don't know, and maybe who knows, the FedEx person might have been like, why is this lady talking to me for so long? Like maybe they didn't want such a conversation, but I think we both enjoyed ourselves, and it was just a really cool interaction to have and to be open to. In many ways, I've been very fortunate, actually, that people are interested. I think we're at a time in the world where people have maybe always been interested, but there's more space to be interested in other things going on. And it's very interesting now. I think it's really important that I'm very passionate on topics of appropriation and other things, and I've written about them, and I talk about them a lot. But I also think that people shouldn't be afraid to be curious about other cultural traditions, and I think we have to hold those two truths at the same time right now. Maybe that's the challenge. We have to interrogate things like uh, certain 19th century repertoire, for example. This is very common in opera, but it's there in other it's there in even a lot of orchestral music as well, where people were imagining, say, things like the Eastern world and stuff, or other parts of the world, like continents they had not been to before. And it's not that we can't play those pieces. I mean, I think there's very, very nuanced conversations we have to have about them, though. So, the people are interrogating those things right now, which I think is good, because I would say that as a student, I always felt a little bit weird about, like, I don't know, operas like Lakme, this takes place in India, but, the composer had never been, and sort of imagining, they had these kind of, we call them Orientalist views of the world that's not the most flattering. And there's generally operating on a view that, like, Europe was the most superior. So from there, that's a problematic thing. I think we can agree today. But at the same time, we don't want to become afraid of doing repertoire from other traditions, which I think it's beautiful that you're having this concert that you are and exploring other things, because music is a vehicle, just like learning languages is another vehicle for us to learn about other cultures and to realize that there are a lot of things that bind us together that are similar, as well as there are these beautiful differences. And I think that, today we got into some technical things about how you phrase this musical material. It will not only, I think, impact how you would play this piece, but hopefully how you think about music more generally. And for those of you who do like to create and such, maybe it gives you ideas. And I think that's okay. I think that's okay, as long as we can kind of figure out what our sources have been and acknowledge those, just like Arjuna did in his life. Is just to acknowledge our sources. And so in that way, like, I have been so deeply influenced by Western classical music. It's my second language, but it is very much still my language of music, and has deeply permeated my life. And so I get to live this kind of dual life where I'm often in Western classical spaces, but I'm also still getting to operate in Indian music spaces as well, as a performer, as a listener, as a student. And I think having those dualities, there's nothing wrong with ever having more in one's life. So I think it's just more opportunities for us to connect and for us to talk. And for me to share this piece with all of you is a chance for me to actually talk about myself, to share about myself with this. And in this conversation, the way that you've so beautifully framed it, I've gotten to learn a little bit more about you too. So it's not just composer, performer coming together for this, what will be a brilliant performance by you, and then it's over. No, it's actually about relationships with people. It's about forming those connections and just opening ourselves up a little bit more, which you can probably tell throughout this whole session. That's something that's very important to me at a personal level. So yeah, I think we're at an interesting point in the field, but I think it's only getting more exciting. And I think there's space for everyone. I think that's what it comes down to. So we just have to consciously protect that space for everybody, regardless of your background, that you can be part of this.